Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, July 15th, 2025. All right, so the first story at the top of antiwar.com today, Trump announces weapons plan for Ukraine. So President Trump on Monday met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte at the White House and announced a plan to provide Ukraine with billions of dollars worth of U.S. military equipment by selling U.S. weapons to NATO countries that will then be transferred to Ukraine. So the president also said that if a peace deal is not reached within 50 days, he will impose tariffs on Russia. A source told Axios that the U.S. is expected to sell $10 billion worth of military equipment to NATO countries in the first wave. So lots of money to be made here for the weapons makers. Explaining the weapons plan to reporters, Rutte said that the idea was to ensure that the U.S., which he described as the police agent of the world, is able to maintain its military stockpiles while also providing a massive amount of weapons to Ukraine. So this is Rutte. He said, quote, "The U.S. needs to make sure it can keep its hands on what the U.S. needs to keep the whole world safe, because in the end, you are the police agent of the whole world. But given that, the U.S. has decided to massively supply Ukraine with what is necessary through NATO. Europeans will be 100% paying for that," end quote. So it just kind of struck me that he said, because, you know, you guys are the world's police. We got to make sure you have all your weapons. I remember when that was kind of an America First talking point, that we should not be the world's police. But anyway, so Trump and Rutte said that they had gotten commitments from European countries to purchase U.S. weapons for Ukraine. Trump said, quote, "I will say that I spoke with Germany, spoke with most of the larger countries, and they are really enthusiastic about this, and they're willing to go really far," end quote. So Trump and Rutte did not elaborate on the types of weapons that would be sent, except to mention that more U.S.-made Patriot air defense systems would be supplied to Ukraine. Sources told Axios that the weapons will also include long-range weapons that can strike deep inside Russia, which, of course, this always comes with the risk of major escalation. And regarding tariffs, Trump threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Russia and secondary tariffs that would target Moscow's trading partners, which, of course, includes China and India. And I find this very hard to believe, Trump saying that they're going to do very severe tariffs in 50 days if there's no peace deal. Now, the tariffs on Russia wouldn't really impact us too much because the U.S. barely trades with Russia at this point. But, I mean, if he's saying that they're going to put 100% tariffs on China and India, I mean, that would be huge. And I find it hard to believe that that would happen. Now, over in the Senate, there's been a bill introduced by Senator Lindsey Graham that has 85 co-sponsors, and that bill calls for the U.S. to impose 500% sanctions on Russia and all of its trading partners. And I mean, that includes all the BRICS nations. Again, 500% tariffs on China. It's completely insane. The fact that 85 senators have sponsored that bill just goes to show that these people are just crazy. I mean, this is just not a realistic proposal, but this is something that Trump is threatening now. And he said in the press conference that, you know, he said he was going to do 100%. Then he said, maybe we'll do the 500%. So we'll see what happens. So while Trump was announcing all these measures to continue this proxy war in Ukraine, he's also trying to distance himself from the conflict, calling it a Biden war and a Democrat war, even though he was actually the first one to send missiles to Ukraine during his first term in office. The president, Trump, insisted that he still wants to bring the conflict to an end and that he hopes the new military aid and tariff threat will do that. He said, quote, "This is not Trump's war. We're here to get it finished and stopped," end quote. But this is just a continuation of the Biden policy. We're going to send more weapons and issue sanctions, or threaten them at least. And so this is really a continuation of what U.S. policy has been. and there's no sign that this is going to lead to a peace deal, because Russia has made it very clear that they're not going to stop until their terms are met, and that includes Ukrainian neutrality and the recognition of the oblasts that it annexed in 2022 as Russian territory. And Ukraine is not going to concede those demands, especially Zelensky and the people in power in Ukraine are not going to concede those demands as long as the weapons spigot is still open, and the U.S. and NATO continue to provide this support. If Zelensky signs some kind of deal like that and then there's elections, I mean, he's done, and his legacy will be the person who lost this war. So the whole thing is just a mess, and Trump's doubling down on Biden's policy, and now he can sell it and say, oh, we're not paying for these weapons. But it's still fueling and continuing this horrific war. Then that just goes on every day. All right, so the next one here: Israeli attacks kill 117 Palestinians in Gaza over 24 hours. So the daily death toll from Gaza, and I know, maybe it sounds repetitive to keep covering stories like this every day, but I think it's just important for people to know, what the daily situation in Gaza is like, especially for Americans, what our government, the daily slaughter that our government is supporting and enabling. So Gaza's health ministry said on Monday that Israeli attacks killed 117 Palestinians and wounded 557 over the previous 24-hour period, as relentless U.S.-backed Israeli strikes continue to pound the strip. Israeli strikes on Monday included an airstrike on tents in the Al-Mawasi area of Khan Yunis, southern Gaza. According to Al Jazeera, at least 9 Palestinians were killed in those strikes, most of them children. This is a boy who was injured in that bombing of the tents in Khan Yunis. The fact that they just bomb tents every day, and it's just something that's become normal. I mean, just so horrific. And this is just a sampling of some of the violence. Wafa reported that at least 7 people were killed by Israeli attacks on different areas of Gaza City. At least 4 were killed in the Berej refugee camp in central Gaza. The Israeli military said on Monday that 3 of its soldiers were killed by an explosion in a tank in Jabalia, northern Gaza, and did not specify the cause of the blast. And Israeli forces continue to kill Palestinians seeking aid. The health ministry said that it recorded the death of 5 aid seekers over this 24 hours, and the aid massacres continue. And since the end of May, since the GHF began operating in Gaza, at least 838 people have been killed and 5,575 have been wounded while seeking aid. And there was a video I saw on Twitter today that came out of Gaza of a group of Palestinians trying to reach one of these aid sites, getting shot at, gunfire near them, and they're all on the ground, laying on the ground to avoid being killed. And that's what they have to do if they want to get a morsel of food from these so-called aid sites. All right, so the next one here: families of Israeli captives reach out to Hamas over truce talks. So this one is from Middle East Eye. This is kind of interesting. So the families of Israeli captives held in Gaza reached out to Hamas through a representative to ask about the fate of stalled ceasefire talks, Middle East Eye can reveal. Sources told Middle East Eye that the third party reached out to Hamas after the captives' families feared that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to torpedo a possible deal. A senior figure within Hamas told the representative to relay to the families that it was serious about reaching an agreement to end the war and release the captives, but that it was facing intransigent Israeli positions. The sources quoted Hamas as saying, quote, Hamas is serious about reaching an agreement to end the war and establish arrangements that can ensure calm and stability. It has demonstrated significant flexibility and positive responsibility during the negotiations rounds. Israel has insisted on continuing the war, destroying the Gaza Strip, displacing its population, and imposing a state of hunger, suffering, and ongoing massacres that have not ceased for a single day, end quote. So Hamas and Israel reached a brief 3-stage ceasefire in January, but the deal collapsed in March after Israel took back several of its captives and resumed bombing Gaza, walking away from the deal before talks with Hamas on a permanent end to the war could start. Since then, the Trump administration has given Israel full backing to wage war on Gaza. And according to the sources, the Hamas official told the representative that Hamas had complied with everything stipulated in the first phase of the previous ceasefire. So essentially, it's interesting that that the families of the captives in Gaza are so desperate that they're going to Hamas to figure out what the state of negotiations are. And the reports say that the negotiations have stalled over Israel's demand to maintain occupation of about 40 to 45% of Gaza's territory, and of course, the talk of building a concentration camp on the ruins of Rafah. And so they have more of the messages here saying that Hamas told the representative to convey to the families that it was Netanyahu who returned to war after the ceasefire and everything. And they're saying that they responded positively to U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff's ceasefire proposal in order to reach an agreement, but that Netanyahu was taking a hardline stance and seeking to control large swaths of the Strip and displace more than 600,000 Palestinians. And that's a reference to the concentration camp plan. The Israeli defense minister, said the initial plan is to put 600,000 Palestinians in there, and eventually the entire civilian population. So if you're planning that, it's clear that they're not looking for any kind of permanent ceasefire. And the talks, as far as we know, remain deadlocked. Hopefully some kind of breakthrough happens. So something, I feel like just something's got to give here. It's just been so brutal day in and day out. All right, so the next one here, Kamal, Adwan hospital chief, starved, tortured, and isolated in Israeli jail. This article is from The Cradle. So the condition of Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the director of North Gaza's Kamal Adwan Hospital, who was abducted by Israeli forces at the end of last year, has continued to deteriorate, his lawyer said on July 14th. So Dr. Abu Safia was taken by Israeli forces toward the end of 2024. If you remember, there was a huge siege on these areas of northern Gaza where they completely cut off all the aid. And he was at the Kamal Adwan Hospital there, and they eventually took it over and threw him in and captured him. And he's been in prison ever since. And he's being, according to his lawyer, he's being tortured. His lawyer said that he lost around 40 kilograms of weight, which is about 80 pounds since his abduction and detention by Israel. I mean, that's huge. And we've seen these, there was a report in Haaretz that I covered the other day about the torture of Palestinian prisoners and of these dramatic weight losses, and especially among young men who go in there, or teenagers or children who go into prison healthy. And in some cases, some have died in prison because of the conditions, because of the starvation. And so this is what Abu Safia's lawyer is saying, and he remains in captivity after all this time. All right, so the next one here, church leaders visit Christian West Bank village. So the leaders of Christian churches in the Holy Land visited the Palestinian Christian village of Taibeh in the Israeli-occupied West Bank on Monday to show support amid increasing settler attacks. The Council of Patriarchs and Heads of Churches of Jerusalem said in a joint statement that they were in Taibeh, quote, in solidarity with the local community following an intensifying trend of systemic and targeted attacks against them and their presence. We ask for the prayers, attention, and action of the world, particularly that of Christians globally, end quote. The visit came a week after Jewish settlers set a fire right next to the historic Church of St. George, which was built in the 5th century, and 3 priests in Taibeh issued a plea for help. This is a picture of the church leaders. So they said, quote, we give thanks for the local residents and firefighters for extinguishing the fire before our holy sites were destroyed, but we join voices with the local priests, Greek Orthodox, Latin, and Melkite Greek Catholic, issuing a clear plea for support in the face of repeated systematic attacks from these radicals, which are only growing more frequent, end quote. So settlers have been grazing cattle in the agricultural land in the area, destroying olive trees and olive groves, and they've also been attacking homes, setting other things on fire. The church leader said that the settlers also erected a billboard that read, "You have no future here." So they put up a big sign that said, "You have no future here," because their goal is to drive the locals out of their homes so they can take over the land. These are intimidation tactics meant to terrorize people and drive them out of their homes, out of their land. The church leaders said, quote, The attacks by the hands of settlers against our community, which is living in peace, must stop both here in Taipei and elsewhere throughout the West Bank. This is clearly part of the systematic attacks against Christians that we see unfolding throughout the region, end quote. So Cardinal Pier Battista Pizzaballa, the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, spoke in Taipei and said that the West Bank was becoming a lawless area. He said, quote, "The only law is that of power and of those who have force, not the law. We must work for the law to return to this part of the country so anyone can appeal to the law to enforce their rights," end quote. And the Palestinians, the fact is, the Palestinians living under occupation in the West Bank have no rights under the Israeli military rule. So Pizzaballa prayed at the St. George Church with the Greek Orthodox Patriarch in the region, Theophilos III, and diplomats representing several countries, including the UK, Russia, China, Japan, Jordan, and the EU, also visited Taipei on Monday. And there was no sign that the U.S. sent any representative. And Mike Huckabee, the Christian Zionist who is the U.S. ambassador to Israel, who openly supports the Israeli settlements and the Israeli annexation of the West Bank, he has been silent on these attacks on Christians, which is not a surprise because he has a twisted theology and believes that God gave this land to the modern state of Israel. So he's just been quiet about this. But it seems like there is a lot of attention on this village. So hopefully it causes the settlers to back off. All right, so the next one here, Ultra-Orthodox announced they will leave Netanyahu's coalition. So this article is from Haaretz. So it looks like Netanyahu might be in political trouble yet again. Dagel HaTorah, the Lithuanian faction of the Ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party, announced on Monday evening that it will leave the Netanyahu coalition and government. And later on Monday, Agudat Yisrael, the other faction of UTJ, announced that it would also be leaving the coalition. And the decision was made in response to the government not advancing a bill to exempt ultra-Orthodox from IDF service. Talks were held in the Knesset to draft a version of the bill with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the Foreign Affairs Defense Committee chair, and the coalition chair taking part. A party official told Haaretz that the draft exemption law was presented to representatives of Dagel HaTorah and that Netanyahu himself made changes to the document during the meeting. The official said that Netanyahu demanded that Edelstein present the text of the law that he had pledged to on the eve of the attack on Iran, otherwise he would be fired. According to him, the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee is presenting the text unwillingly. So this is what am I trying to say here? So this happened, right before the war with Iran. Netanyahu was in trouble. The ultra-Orthodox parties were threatening to quit his government, and he worked out a deal with them. And this kind of confirms that he basically told them, we're going to do this, we'll work it out, but right now it's war with Iran. I need your support for that, so stay in the government for that. And Mike Huckabee also met with these Haredi lawmakers to convince them not to dissolve the government. But anyway, so as far as I understand right now, it seems like they're still in negotiations. These guys are saying that they are going to leave. But as far as I understand it, if this party leaves, the Netanyahu government will still have like a tiny majority, just maybe by one seat. But if the Shah's party, which is another ultra-Orthodox party, leaves, then they'll lose the minority. They'll lose the majority, and then the government could be dissolved and new elections could happen. And, of course, that's what Netanyahu wants to avoid at all costs here. So Netanyahu tends to figure out how to survive political crises like this. So we'll see what happens. But, I mean, it could make a difference when it comes to the ceasefire things. The one issue is if just this party leaves and they have just that one seat, that would give both Smotrich and Ben-Gvir even more power and influence over Netanyahu, which just would not be good. All right, so the next one here, 89 killed in Druze-Bedouin fighting in Syria. So this article is from Jason Ditz. So fighting between the Druze population in Syria's Suwaida governorate and local Bedouin tribes continues to escalate after breaking out on Sunday. According to the figures on Monday, at least 89 people had been killed in the fighting and around 200 others were wounded. So again, we don't really know the circumstances of what sparked these clashes. Both sides are accusing the other of things like kidnappings and things like that. But it's significant fighting, and the Syrian government, the HTS government, has intervened on the side of the Bedouins. So they're fighting against the Druze, which is a minority that the HTS guys do not like. So I'm sure they're happy to join this fight against them. And at least out of the 89 killed, 14 were HTS security forces, 50 locals were killed, local Druze, along with 18 Bedouins. Actually, the locals is, I think, both Druze and Bedouins, and then 18 Bedouins that came in from the surrounding area. 7 other fighters in military uniforms were killed, and they have yet to be identified. 2 women and 2 children were also slain in the chaos. So very heavy fighting. Another sign of the new Syria is, how unstable this whole situation in Syria is. All right, so the next one here, Israel attacks tanks in Syria. So Israel got in on the battle, it seemed like, and started launching airstrikes. Another one from Jason here. So Israel has carried out airstrikes against Syrian tanks in the village of Sami, claiming they had entered the restricted zone, which they are forbidden from. So this is a zone that doesn't actually exist, that Israel just declared that the Syrian military cannot send forces south of this line. So that's how they justified these strikes. And that's how the IDF justified them. And then you had Israel Katz, the defense minister, claiming that the purpose of the airstrikes is to protect the Druze minority. So he's acting like it's some kind of humanitarian intervention here. But this is something that they've declared. There can't be like a militarized force in this certain area. And this is very far from Israel or any Israeli-controlled occupied territory that's in southwest Syria. All right, so the next one here, Iran says no talks if the U.S. demands zero enrichment. So a senior advisor to Iranian Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei said on Monday that the U.S. must respect Iran's red lines if it wants to resume nuclear negotiations and not demand that Tehran abandon uranium enrichment. So Ali Velayati said, quote, "They say Iran must abandon uranium enrichment, but this is one of our red lines. If talks are conditional on halting enrichment, they simply won't happen," end quote. So Trump, of course, has been threatening to bomb Iran again if it resumes its uranium enrichment program, something that Tehran says that it has the right to do as a signatory to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, since it has pledged not to develop nuclear weapons. It remains unclear how long it would take Tehran to restart enrichment following the U.S. and Israeli attacks on its nuclear program. And also on Monday, Iran's foreign ministry denied reports that said that there was a meeting scheduled between Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, and U.S. Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff. I've seen multiple reports saying that they're going to meet since the end of the war. Hasn't happened. Iran has not confirmed that it's holding talks with the U.S., and they're denying these reports. And Iranian officials have said that they also need guarantees from the U.S. that the U.S. or Israel will not attack again during talks, since the previous negotiations were used as a cover to launch a surprise attack. And the Iranian military also says that it's preparing for the possibility of another war. Iran's defense minister said that Iran does not trust the ceasefire, and there certainly is a possibility of this thing exploding again. All right, so the next one here, the U.S. presses allies on preparations for Taiwan war. So the Pentagon is pressing Japan and Australia to make clear what role they would play if the U.S. goes to war with China over Taiwan. And this was reported by the Financial Times over the weekend. The report said that the Pentagon's policy chief, Elbridge Colby, has been pressing the issue in recent meetings with Japanese and Australian officials, an effort that has frustrated officials in Tokyo and Canberra. Appearing to confirm the report, Colby said in a post on X that the Pentagon is implementing President Trump's America First foreign policy by urging allies to step up their defense and other efforts related to our collective defense in both Europe and Asia. He said, quote, "Of course, some among our allies might not welcome frank conversations," end quote. So Colby is a serious China hawk, and he's a major proponent of the U.S. preparing for war over Taiwan, despite the risk of nuclear war. I know people who like Colby because he advises against war with Iran, or at least he has before. Obviously, he was involved in it since he's the Pentagon policy chief, and and everything. But he kind of advocates for reducing U.S. involvement in the Middle East and in Ukraine. So the U.S., but it's not a noble intention. It's so he wants to reduce that stuff so the U.S. can get ready for war with China over Taiwan. And he very strongly believes that the U.S. should commit to going to war with China over Taiwan, despite the risk of nuclear war. He really wants to push. And, I followed him on Twitter over the past few years in between. He was in the first Trump administration for about a year, I think. And then in between that administration and this one, he wrote a book called The Strategy of Denial, all about how the U.S. needs to prevent China from expanding in the Asia Pacific. And he became kind of the leading figure among the China hawks who want to really prioritize Asia. And he really wants to, and he says things, he's like, I can't think of exactly some things that he said, but about what the U.S. should do if Taiwan doesn't increase military spending. Like, he says things very frankly. So I could see him, annoying these Japanese and Australian officials. And they're also, it is just kind of, to me at least, a really crazy thing to be even discussing. The idea of war with China. I mean, the U.S. and China can't go to war. I mean, at least that should be the attitude. But he's all about getting ready for it. And of course, when he talks about it, he'll say, oh, this is deterrence. We're not seeking war. But all this stuff has just ratcheted up tensions in the region, making war more likely. And it's just, we're not going in a good direction here when it comes to China and Taiwan. And what's funny about this is that essentially, so this report says that the U.S. was asking for concrete commitments from Japan and Australia. Like, so what would you do if there was a war? Would you intervene directly? I guess, we don't know exactly what the conversation was like. It didn't detail it like that. But they wanted something concrete. But the U.S. has a policy known as strategic ambiguity on the question of whether or not it would intervene directly to fight China if it invaded Taiwan. And this report says that officials kind of pointed that out, saying, why would we commit to this when you're not committed to it? Now, the policy of strategic ambiguity has eroded in recent years, especially with Joe Biden declared several times that if China attacked Taiwan, he would intervene. But Trump has declined to make that commitment. However, Pete Hegseth said some very provocative things related to China and Taiwan at the Shangri-La Dialogue back in May in Singapore. He said if deterrence fails and China attacks Taiwan, that the U.S. is prepared to fight and win decisively. He added a qualifier there. He said that if China attacks and if I am called upon by my commander-in-chief, we are prepared to do what the Department of Defense does best, fight and win decisively. So, there's a qualifier. If the president calls me to do it, he's not saying directly that they will, but he's also, the U.S. military is openly preparing for a war with China. And to me, again, that is pretty crazy and not something that should even be thought of as a possibility. All right, so the next one here, the Senate NDAA would add $32 billion. So the Senate Armed Services Committee has approved its version of the 2026 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, which would add approximately $32 billion to President Trump's planned military budget of $1.01 trillion. So the Senate NDAA would provide $924.7 billion in military spending. And the additional $32 billion would go toward shipbuilding, munitions, and investments in the F-35 fighter jet. So that's the Senate's NDAA is $924 billion. The White House requested $896 billion. But to get to $1.0 trillion, they're taking money from the reconciliation bill, what Trump has called the Big Beautiful Bill. That included $150 billion in extra military spending. They're going to take $113 billion of that to put it towards the 2026 military spending budget. So that would bring, based on Trump's plan, that would bring it to $1.01 trillion. If this extra $32 billion is added, it would bring it to $1.033 trillion. So just astronomical numbers here that we're talking about. And so the thing is, the way that this works with the NDAA, the Senate committee, they come up with their NDAA, the House committee comes up with theirs, and then they go to conference and they reconcile and they negotiate, and then they come up with the final bill that then goes to the floor for a vote. So there's a chance that this $32 billion is not included. In fact, last year, the Senate's version had an extra $25 billion that was eventually taken out. So we'll see how this shakes out. But it's just crazy numbers here, and they just want more, more, more. All right, so the next one here, the last story, Space Force holds largest orbital warfare drill. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So the newest branch of the American Armed Forces is conducting its largest war games to date. The drills, dubbed Resolute Space 25, will involve 700 members of the Space Force stationed across the globe. The Air Force is conducting its integrated exercises. A statement from the Space Force said that the intent of the exercise is to incorporate at large scale space-based and space-enabled capabilities to include, but not limited to, space electromagnetic warfare, space domain awareness, orbital military warfare, and navigational warfare. A top-ranking Guardian, which is what they call the members of the Space Force, said the purpose of the drills is to establish that the Space Force is ready to fight and win in space. Chief of Space Operations General Chance Saltzman said, quote, Resolute Space sends a clear message. Guardians are prepared to fight and win in space, shoulder to shoulder with our joint and allied partners. By training at this unprecedented scale, we're sharpening warfighter instincts, strengthening combat credibility, and proving our commitment to deliver peace through strength in the face of any challenge, end quote. So the Space Force has been established in 2019, and it has seen its budget rapidly increase. The so-called Big Beautiful Bill that was recently signed into law by Trump increased the Space Force's funding to $40 billion, a 30% rise. And this militarization of space is just kind of really bums me out. It's kind of just inevitable, I guess, that this is the way things are going to go, unless people get serious about arms control again. So that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Ramsey Baroud, The Economy of Genocide Report, A Reckoning Beyond Rhetoric. One from Ted Galen Carpenter, How Firm is Washington's Commitment to Taiwan Security? One from Richard Hinman, American Cult, Why Our Special Ops Need a Reset. One from Brad Pierce, We Don't Have to Do Any of This. And our spotlight from George D. O'Neill Jr., Why Negotiations with Russia Seem So Difficult. So please go check all that out. Lots of other stuff on our page. Go visit antiwar.com. Check out our blog and all that stuff. But you could always support antiwar.com with a monetary donation by going to antiwar.com/donate, or you could share our articles, tell your friends about antiwar.com. Like and subscribe, comment when it comes to the show, and follow us on social media. We crossed 100,000 on Twitter, or X as they call it these days, so thank you for that. That is it for me for today. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Thanks for listening.